Welcome to Compact Warfare from compactwarfare.com, the show where we explore key moments from the history of conflict, from ancient battlefields to modern warfare. This is episode 42, The Wars of the Roses. The Wars of the Roses were a series of dynastic conflicts that convulsed England between 1455 and 1487. At their heart lay a struggle within the royal house of Plantagenet, whose two senior branches, Lancaster and York, both traced descent from Edward III. Political fragility after the lengthy and costly 100 Years' War, a weak king in Henry VI, and the ambitions of powerful nobles created a combustible mix. The crown's finances were strained, the wool trade faltered in the 1450s, and royal justice often failed in the shires. Factional quarrels at court hardened into armed camps. At the same time, the crown's inability to reward loyalty or restrain violence encouraged magnates to raise private armies through the system known as bastard feudalism. Henry VI's bouts of mental illness in 1453 and 1454 left the government rudderless. During his incapacity, Richard, Duke of York, was appointed protector. York was a senior prince with a strong hereditary claim and a record of service in France and Ireland. His growing influence alarmed rivals, notably the Queen, Margaret of Anjou, and the powerful Beaufort and Percy families. When Henry recovered, York lost the protectorship and tensions sharpened. The kingdom slid toward trial by battle, not through a single act, but through years of grievances, slights, and local feuds that national leaders failed to heal. Open warfare began at the First Battle of St Albans in May 1455, where Yorkist forces under York and his ally Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, scattered the royal host and killed key Lancastrian nobles. This was more a sharp shock than a conclusive victory, but it set a pattern for the future. Local risings flared, courts were disrupted, and both sides competed to frame their actions as a defense of good governance against malicious councillors. In 1459, hostilities resumed. The Lancastrian victory at Ludford Bridge drove the Yorkist leaders into exile. They returned with swift purpose in 1460, defeating royalists at Northampton and capturing Henry VI. At Wakefield in December 1460, however, fortune reversed. The Duke of York was killed, along with his second son Edmund, Earl of Rutland. The Yorkist cause passed to York's eldest son, Edward, Earl of March. Edward proved energetic and decisive. He won at Mortimer's Cross in February 1461, while Warwick, despite a setback at the Second Battle of St Albans, held the Yorkist coalition together. Edward entered London and was proclaimed King Edward IV. The decisive test came at Towton on Palm Sunday, the 29th of March 1461. Fought in driving snow, Towton was likely the most significant and bloodiest battle on English soil. Yorkist archers exploited the wind, drawing Lancastrians into a murderous exchange before the lines closed. As fighting stretched through the day, the arrival of fresh Yorkist troops under the Duke of Norfolk broke the Lancastrian flank. The rout was catastrophic. Henry VI and Margaret of Anjou fled north, then into Scotland and later to the continent. Edward IV's claim was secured, though the realm remained unsettled. Edward's initial years were devoted to pacifying resistance and restoring royal solvency. He moved against remaining Lancastrian strongholds in the north and the Welsh marches, rewarded loyalists with lands, and worked to restart trade. His policies toward Calais and the wool staple were pragmatic, and he cultivated the merchant elite of London. Edward also relied on the support of Warwick, whose command of Calais and reputation as a captain had earned him the nickname Kingmaker. The alliance frayed in 1464 when Edward revealed that he had secretly married Elizabeth Woodville, a relatively obscure widow from a gentry family. The match angered Warwick, who had pursued a French marriage for the king. The rapid advancement of the Woodvilles, combined with Edward's growing independence in policy, widened the breach. Diplomatic differences sharpened it further, as Warwick preferred alignment with France, while Edward increasingly courted Burgundy. By 1469, discontent erupted into rebellion. Warwick allied himself with Edward's disaffected brother, George, Duke of Clarence, and sponsored risings that exposed the crown's fragility. For a time in 1470, Yorkist rule collapsed. Warwick and Clarence fled to France, where Louis XI brokered an astonishing reconciliation between Warwick and Margaret of Anjou. In the autumn of 1470, Warwick invaded, Edward fled overseas, and Henry VI was restored in a brief Lancastrian revival known as the Readeption. However, the restoration proved unstable, and in March 1471, Edward returned from exile with Burgundian backing, landed at Ravenspur, and gathered support as he marched south. He reconciled with Clarence, who defected from Warwick's side. At Barnet on Easter Sunday, 1471, Edward's smaller but better coordinated army defeated Warwick in swirling fog. Warwick was killed while fleeing the field. 3 weeks later at Tewkesbury, Edward destroyed the last significant Lancastrian army. Margaret of Anjou was captured, and her son, Edward of Westminster, the Lancastrian heir, was killed during or after the battle. Henry VI died in the Tower of London soon after, with many believing that he was probably murdered. Edward IV's second reign began with the Lancastrian line extinguished and armed resistance broken. From 1471 to 1483, Edward IV governed with greater assurance. He pursued steady finance, exploited customs revenues, and developed the Yorkist affinity in the shires through loyal lieutenants. He employed bonds and recognizances to discipline troublesome nobles, and built a court that mixed chivalric pageantry with a merchant's sense of profit. His household and council functioned more reliably, and disorder declined. The realm experienced a measure of stability not seen since the 1440s. Edward's sudden death on the 9th of April 1483 at the age of 40 set the stage for renewed crisis. His heir, Edward V, was a minor. Edward's brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, a capable northern magnate, was named protector. Within weeks, the political ground shifted. Gloucester moved against the Woodvilles, arrested leading figures, and placed the young king and his brother Richard of Shrewsbury in the Tower. In June, a sermon and a petition alleged that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been invalid due to a prior contract, rendering their children illegitimate. Parliament later ratified this claim in the statute Titulus Regius. Gloucester took the crown as Richard III. Richard's short reign remains one of the most contested episodes in the saga. The former young king, Edward V, and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York, were imprisoned in the Tower of London. But the disappearance of the princes from the Tower by late 1483 poisoned public opinion and provided a rallying cry for enemies. A rising led by Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, failed that autumn, but the coalition behind it incubated a more formidable challenger, Henry Tudor. Exiled in Brittany and later in France, Henry had a distant Lancastrian claim through his mother, Margaret Beaufort. His real strength lay in the ability to unify discontented Yorkists and surviving Lancastrian sympathizers under a simple promise. He would marry Edward IV's eldest daughter, Elizabeth of York, and reconcile the warring lines. In August 1485, Henry Tudor landed at Milford Haven with French support and Welsh recruits. He marched east, gathering men cautiously. Richard, who was not without allies, mustered a royal host and moved to intercept. The armies met at Bosworth Field on the 22nd of August. The battle turned on the unreliable conduct of magnates who hedged their bets. The Stanley family, outwardly neutral until the critical moment, intervened in Henry's favour as Richard charged personally toward Henry's standard. Richard was killed in the melee, marking the last time an English king died in battle. Henry was crowned on the field and entered London as Henry VII. Henry strengthened his position through careful symbolism and policy. He dated his reign from the day before Bosworth, which made Richard's supporters traitors by law. He secured parliamentary recognition, married Elizabeth of York to fuse the rival claims, and adopted the Tudor rose that combined the white and red roses of York and Lancaster into a single emblem. The phrase Wars of the Roses would only become common centuries later, popularized by writers like Sir Walter Scott, but the visual politics of reconciliation began immediately. The wars did not end in a single day. In 1487, a Yorkist faction backed the impostor Lambert Simnel, who was crowned in Dublin as Edward VI and supported by John de la Pole, Earl of Lincoln. The rebels invaded through Lancashire, but were defeated at the Battle of Stoke Field in June 1487, often regarded as the final pitched battle of the wars. Another pretender, Perkin Warbeck, troubled the regime through the 1490s with foreign backing before his capture and execution. By then, however, Henry's network of surveillance, bonds, and legal pressure had curtailed the independence of overmighty subjects that had fueled the earlier conflicts. The wars were not continuous fighting, but intermittent campaigns punctuated by years of uneasy peace. Armies were raised through indentures with retainers and allies, rather than through old feudal summons alone. Longbowmen remained central, as at Towton, but heavy cavalry charges still mattered when morale wavered. The period also saw increasing use of handguns and field artillery, although gunpowder weapons were often more critical in sieges than in open battle. Command was personal, decisions fast, and outcomes often swayed by the desertion or duplicity of magnates who weighed risk and reward on the day. Casualties could be severe in defeat because flight across winter rivers or narrow roads often turned a withdrawal into a slaughter. Badges and pageantry shaped loyalties and memory. Yorkists used the white rose, the sun in splendour, and the falcon and fetterlock. Lancastrians used the red rose and the antelope. Poets and chroniclers presented victories as proof of divine favour and defeats as punishment for sin or treachery. Queens and noblewomen were active agents, especially Margaret of Anjou and Elizabeth Woodville, who negotiated marriages, mobilised supporters, and managed estates while the men marched. The City of London played a pivotal role as financier and gatekeeper to legitimacy, often siding with the claimant who promised stability and sound money. By 1487, the English monarchy was stronger in some ways and more cautious in others. The wars had culled the senior nobility, allowing the crown to redistribute lands and reshape regional power. Kings learned to manage magnates with carrots and sticks, offering patronage but enforcing order through legal instruments and councils. Henry VII's use of bonds and recognizances restricted private feuds, while his control of marriage alliances and wardships curbed independent noble strategies. Trade recovered, royal finances improved, and the routine of government settled after decades of shock. Historians still argue over causes and turning points. Some stress structural weaknesses in late medieval governance and finance. Others highlight the personality and illness of Henry VI, or the ambition of a few great families. The traditional image of two neat factions, each wearing a rose, oversimplifies a conflict in which many gentry members switched sides more than once, and local grievances influenced their choices. What endures is the dramatic sequence of reversals, the emergence of strong personalities like Warwick, Edward IV, Margaret of Anjou, and Richard III, and the lasting shift toward a monarchy that relied less on feudal obligation and more on financial and legal instruments to secure obedience. The Wars of the Roses began as a crisis of kingship and ended as a lesson in statecraft. They showed how a weak crown could lose control to factions, how battlefield success could collapse without stable finance and law, and how legitimacy could be rebuilt through marriage, symbolism, and steady governance. From the streets of St Albans to the snows at Towton and the muddy field at Bosworth, the struggle remade the political map of England. The Tudor settlement did not erase memory of the scars, but it turned a feud of roses into a story of union, a reminder that dynastic conflict can destroy a realm and also teach it how to endure. I hope you enjoyed that episode of Compact Warfare from compactwarfare.com. If you did, please leave a review wherever you get your podcasts, and while you're there, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.